And I just wanted to mention also to everyone that the Greenwich Library is here with you, always available to respond to phone and web inquiries Monday through Sunday. Now, tonight's presentation is expected to run from 7 to 8 o'clock. And again, we reserve time for questions at the end. As you saw, we will be recording also. So without any further delay, I'm excited to welcome Wes Haynes. Wes is Executive Director of the Merritt Parkway Conservancy, and tonight he's discussing literacy landmarks. Wes, I'm going to mute myself, but I'll be in the background as I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rick. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. You might wonder why the Merritt Parkway Conservancy is providing a tour, a virtual tour of libraries. Well, it's all about context. The Merritt Parkway is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and many of the places that the space that it moves through, the areas around it, have historic resources that are on the National Register or are eligible for the National Register. And we thought that this would be a nice way to celebrate the Scenic Byway aspect of the Merritt Parkway. We don't have a commercial strip, so we can't really promote merchants that are lined up along the Parkway, but we can talk about our fellow cultural resources. And they're very important, and they were the places that the very careful siting of the Merritt Parkway conserved and connected by its construction, and now and in some cases created. We're going to stay most of the time today in the 19th century, early 20th century, but we'll look at a couple of historic places that were built after the Parkway as well. So the Merritt Parkway Conservancy is a nonprofit. We are not a state agency. We're a nonprofit of private citizens who work very hard to protect the character, the historic character of the Merritt. We don't we're not trying to restore the Merritt back to its appearance and size in the 1930s when it was built. We're just trying to protect it and keep it very park-like. And I think we're doing a pretty good job. We're 20 years old. We've completed 7.5 phases of construction with the Connecticut Department of Transportation, and the Parkway is looking pretty good right now. But tonight we're going to get off the Parkway, but use the Parkway as a kind of a guide to get to some of these great historic sites that are nearby. And I just want to start by saying, libraries are a very interesting building type in American culture. Architectural historian Kenneth Breich noted that they're among some of the most ingenious, inventive buildings that have been created in American culture. And they're the product really of, as I see it, of a confluence of two cultural disruptions. The first was the public education movement that began in the 1840s that basically tried to upgrade the educational system in the United States, including adult education. And it was wildly successful, probably more so than any other culture in Western history, in terms of creating literacy among a population that was moving around the country, was moving into the country with different languages, and creating a common language for everybody. That public education movement coincides and kind of crosses over and parallels a second movement that was very disruptive, and that was called the City Beautiful movement. It basically started transforming the built environment in our area, certainly, in most of the United States, especially urban and suburban areas, from a very industrial landscape and an agricultural landscape to something that was more formally planned. City Beautiful movement brought us planning and zoning. It brought us the first multifamily housing that was actually planned and not just built as slums. And it also brought us the Merritt Parkway. The Merritt Parkway is considered the last gasp of the City Beautiful movement that really pretty much ended with World War II. So a lot of the libraries we're looking at tonight, although the Parkway doesn't have much to do with the public education movement, it has everything to do with the City Beautiful movement, and many of the libraries we're looking at tonight are also part of that as well. Public education started because printing got very cheap in the 1840s. The rotary printing press was established, and academic libraries as a building type started popping up at places like Harvard and Yale. In the 1850s, it moved out of the academy. The Library of Congress there was a design competition for that. There was really no prototype for a public library at that point. And the Boston Public Library was formed, which was the first library to be a large urban library to be supported with public funding. The City Beautiful movement was sort of created with the establishment of Central Park in New York, but was given a big boost in 1893 with the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. In the midpoint of that, the American Library Association is formed. So we have two professions that are working on libraries. We have a new group of professional architects that come from this country, and a new group of professional librarians. And they both, they're working together to inform what becomes the modern library in America. So this is pretty much a big picture from the 16th century up to the 19th century, the development of libraries. On the far left is Michelangelo's library in Florence for the Medici family. It was essentially a long rectangular room. The books were stored in pew-like benches. They were actually chained to the benches. And so the original layout of a library is a kind of an open area in the middle with book storage on the right and left. And that didn't really change very much with the first generation of academic libraries. This is the middle picture is Henry Austin's Dwight Hall at Yale University, a large tall space with very, very high book alcoves. Now printing has gotten cheaper, and books are much more plentiful by the time this library is built. And then Henry Hobson Richardson's Wynne Memorial Library in Woburn, Massachusetts, is pretty much similar in its layout to the Austin Library, but much grander and much more spacious, and to accommodate the amount of books that were available by the 1870s. And so these libraries, Richardson is the second American to be trained in Europe as an architect. He has very sophisticated design concepts, and he's really generates the original iconography of the first generation of public libraries in America. This is a plan of the Woburn Library, and you can see that the reading rooms were in the center with a flanking librarian's desk, and the library, that means the area where the books were actually stored but not necessarily used, are over to the right. So everybody could see them in this grand space. It was sort of like a jewel box setting for the libraries. The Woburn and many of the early libraries had very complex uses or programs. Woburn included a picture gallery and a little museum off to the other side of the librarian's desk from the book storage. And Richardson did 4 or 5 libraries, mostly similar variations to this plan. And this is what Woburn looked like on the outside. Richardson favored the Romanesque style from southern France. It featured polychromatic window surrounds, as you can see just over the new addition there, and a lot of asymmetrical massing, which allowed Richardson to really innovate and experiment with how to organize the interior of the building. So Fairfield County's first library that's purpose-built as a library and not as a building that could be turned into commercial use if it failed, was the Danbury Library, which is not too far. It's about a half an hour away from the Parkway. Northbound exit 40 or southbound take exit 49 up to Danbury. And it's right in the center of town. It's no longer the library. It's now used as a music center. But you can see from this slightly out of focus postcard image that it was very similar to Richardson's plan in that it had a big center hall for the library storage. It had a little clear story up at the top of the roof that was lighted, provided daylight into the center. And the reading rooms were probably on the side. I haven't been inside this building to really verify. It's now a music center and it's only open on occasion. But it's a very fine building indeed, and it borrows aspects from Austin's 1840s libraries as well as Richardson's 1870 libraries, in the banding and the polychromy around the windows. The architect here, Lorenzo Wheeler, who is a Danbury native, chose to detail the windows in Florentine Gothic. So he's maybe referencing Michelangelo here a little bit as well. It's a very delightful exterior, little quirky details. If you look at the corner of the building, there's a little tiny dwarf column in there that's really quite wonderful and doesn't do anything really structural. It's completely decorative. And the carving on this library is really wonderful. So if you're in downtown Danbury, it's worth taking a stroll down Main Street to see this library, which is our first library in Fairfield County. Now, as I mentioned before, 1876, the American Library Association is formed, and the librarians have different ideas about how a library should be laid out than Richardson does. And they become very vocal. These are the first two presidents of the American Library Association. Both were extremely prominent and influential librarians in establishing what a modern library should be. Justin Windsor on the left was the first librarian of the Boston Public Library when it opened, and also at Harvard University, and the first president of the American Library Association. William Frederick Poole on the right started out in Cincinnati and moved on to Chicago, which was a major modern library advancement in library layout. And he was the second president. And, I think Justin Windsor's quote, "The public wants books to read, not to look at," was a direct criticism of the way that Richardson presented the books, the book alcoves in these very, very grand spaces, which were also very difficult for the librarian staff to actually go up and get the books and then restock them as well. They were always climbing stairs. The books were high up. They were subject to a lot of heat that was very damaging to the books. And Richardson's library plans didn't provide a lot of room for processing books and storing them. So both men were very critical of library design. Windsor was the first one to introduce iron stacks. It was a very bad environment for storing books and also administering books. And so they were working with architects to come up with different types of planning. So Richardson really is the person that makes the breakthrough in the small library, but it's up to others to really improve it into the modern library. Anyway, Pequot in Southport is one of the first truly modern libraries in the United States that incorporates Richardson's iconography, but the building is laid out completely differently than Richardson did. And it's built, it is constructed, it's designed during the heyday of the Richardsons, but it's Richardson libraries, but it's built for certain reasons a little bit later than his last library. And it's extremely modern. It looks very Richardsonian Romanesque on the outside, but on the inside, it's quite different. It's also an example of a pattern of giving in philanthropy. As we looked at the Danbury Library, that was given by the White family, who had made their wealth in hats manufacturing in Danbury. The Marquand Monroe family was the family that gifted this library to the community of Southport. The Marquands arrived in Southport in 1790, and the woman on the right is Virginia Marquand Monroe, who is the fourth generation Marquand, who basically inherited her uncle's wealth, who made it in silversmithing. He was a second generation silversmith, and basically gave it back to the community. And this pattern of philanthropy was called at the time the native son philanthropy. However, Fairfield County has an unusual number of women that acted as the native son, and they were literally called that in the 1890s. This was a pattern of funding libraries. So we have a lot of native daughters that gave things back to the community. And Virginia had a dream on a trip in Scotland that, what she could do with the wealth she inherited. And she said, I want to build a library, but I want to build it in secret from the community and then reveal it as a finished product to the community, which is kind of hard in a small town to do, as you could probably imagine. So she built it like behind her uncle's house. He had a very nice Greek Revival house in the center of Southport, put up walls, and nobody in the community could really see it. And it was under construction for 4 years, and people didn't know if they were building a house for themselves or what was going on back there. And then just basically took the walls down and announced that they were gifting a library to the community. And it was very unusual in the name that they chose for it. It is actually on the site of the second to last battle of the Pequot Wars, the first conflict with Indigenous Americans in Connecticut, and a very horrible war, especially for the Pequot. And they named the library after Indigenous people. It was the first cultural institution, I think, in the United States that was named for Indigenous people. They named it after the war, but it was a sign of respect for the people that had been defeated and pretty much canceled in the colonial era. And it also, they had a really talented architect, Robert Robertson. He was a New York architect, and these are the floor plans that he did. They're very different from Richardson's plan for Woburn Library, in that, like Woburn, it has a kind of an oddball program with a very large lecture hall over on the left, an auditorium, but it has very intimate small reading rooms that are distributed around the center of, and the librarian is positioned in the center of that. And the stacks are in just a closed off room where they could be filed in a systematic way and easily accessed for the people that were drawing on them. Pequot was also unusual in that it had a special collection of early Americana. They had letters of Christopher Columbus and early maps, early publications, early issues of the someone is requesting remote control of my screen. Gloria Chin.
I say ignore it. So we're going to only
Okay.
allow one person to share at a time, and that's you.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
It's a very important collection. Now most of it is a large portion of the really old stuff is stored at Yale at the Beinecke in climate control conditions. They have climate control at Pequot for some of the other materials. So it's a very unusual library. No other library in Connecticut was doing that at the time. So the collection grew, and within 6 years, they needed to expand the stack area, and they expanded it with steel shelving that was the type that Poole and Windsor were advocating for through the American Library Association. And the stacks are really the highlight of the Pequot interior. There are very few libraries that have survived through all the media change in libraries of the late 20th century and now the digital age with their stacks intact. They usually get torn out and turned into computer rooms and things like that. Pequot has its original stacks, which also features a Tiffany window within the stacks, which indicates that they were designed for public access. The window features two figures that were important in the development of printing. These are just some details of the castings on the stacks. They're highly ornamental. It's a beautiful space to just walk through and visit, and I highly recommend it. The reading room has been enlarged from its original footprint, but it's still a very intimate reading room for the public. And the little rooms, the smaller reading rooms and offices, have these wonderful fireplaces which have been painted over the years and have been meticulously restored over time. The auditorium is a spectacular resource. It has wonderful acoustics. If you ever have an opportunity to either hear a lecture there or to hear music there, especially chamber music, it is a lovely spot to visit. Highly worth the visit to Southport. And again, the exterior is very Richardsonian in its character, but the interior is nothing like a Richardsonian library. Plum Memorial in Shelton is another sort of Richardsonian takeoff. It is also the product of native son bequest in part. The Plum family gave the land on the library. This is David Wells Plum. He was a local industrialist. He never left the community and made his fortune elsewhere. He stayed in the community and was involved with politics. He was in the state assembly, and he left his money to build this library. He died before it was completed, and his wife actually finished the library. But it's a lovely library, one of the best preserved in our area. And it's a really nice place to visit as well. The character of the carving on it, which was designed by a local architect, Charles Beardsley, who is from Fairfield County, and he trained under Austin in New Haven, is a really fine piece of work. And the terracotta mixture with brownstone on the trim on the exterior is really quite beautiful and well preserved. The interior is pretty nice too. The fireplace on the right is all terracotta and brick, and the reading room features stained glass windows. It was added onto for a new stack addition in the 1970s, and I think they did a really good job with this addition as well. So this is worth a visit. Shelton is very, very proud of this building, and it by the state of its repair, it really shows. The Stratford Library was a gift to the town of Stratford by another native son who had left to become a publisher in New York by the name of Birdseye Blakeman. And the architect he chose was the architect of the Cornell Library. That's William Miller on the lower right down here, and one of the textbooks that Birdseye published in his publishing career. So he left his money to build this library in Stratford. And it's like the Pequot, it's got a very intimate domestic feeling reading room with a fireplace. This is the outside wall on the left and the inside wall of that outside wall on the right in the main reading room. The carving here isn't quite as elaborate. It's a harder stone than the sandstone, so the carving is less pronounced throughout. It was added onto twice, first with the building on the left, which was built in the 1920s by the Sterling family, which funded the Sterling Library at Yale. And then there's a connector that connects the two in the back that was added, I believe, in the 1980s. So those were the first Richardsonian generation. The next generation of libraries will be influenced by neoclassicism that was brought in with the World's Fair as part of the City Beautiful movement. The City Beautiful movement wasn't just promoting an architectural style, but it was talking about a way of planning, a way of situating buildings within relationship to one another, a way of improving downtowns and setting boundaries and opening up long views towards buildings. And so these buildings were very carefully designed and sited. And two of the major examples in urban areas were McKimmey and White's Boston Public Library from 1895 and Career and Hastings New York Public from 1900 to 1911. Probably everybody on tonight is familiar with, certainly with New York Public and maybe Boston as well. And the first expression of neoclassicism in Fairfield County near the Parkway is in Greenwich. And it's the original Greenwich Reading Room, which no longer exists, but it's a really important building and a really interesting building for a number of reasons. If you look at this, it's a neoclassical building with two tall columns next to it. That's a very Neo-Palladian motif that Palladio was a Renaissance architect that was more or less fetishized in the early 18th century in England. And that's a Palladian motif, but mixed up with a lot of Greek Revival trim on the roof and the kind of triangulation from the Greek Revival in the pediment over the doorway. So it's not a copy of anything from antiquity. It's a very creative use of classical styles. You can also see that it's not symmetrical. So it's sort of Richardsonian in that aspect, although it's using a style that is normally very symmetrical. And the stacks are expressed over on the left with the very narrow slit windows. So the stacks was a separate thing from the reading room, and the reading room was off to the right in this building. It was funded by the wealth from the Milbank family. Elizabeth Milbank Anderson inherited her father's wealth that was made by supplying tin milk to the Union troops during the Civil War. Charles Alonzo Rich, who was a partner in the firm of Lamb and Rich, a very, very talented and under-recognized architect, was the architect here. And it appears to me that Elizabeth Milbank Anderson allowed Rich to incorporate the current thinking of library science into the design and also a lot of creative license. Unfortunately, the building, I don't think, was very much loved for its asymmetry. And at some point in the 1930s, it was revisited, and the stacks were probably moved to an addition in the back. And the facade was, there was an attempt to make the facade looking symmetrical. And in the 1960s, the building was torn down and replaced. It's on the site of the Saks building in down on Greenwich Avenue. So another neoclassical building is up in Ridgefield. It's the Morris Memorial Library, a very small neoclassical, very carefully designed building. This was a memorial library of a husband for his deceased wife. The architect was Raleigh Gildersleeve, who did a number of buildings on the Princeton University campus. I don't think he did any libraries there, but I'm not really certain about that. And it was a very small, similar scale to the other libraries we've seen, in that the stacks were over on the left and the reading room was on the sunnier south side of the building. This is what it looks like today with an addition by Newman Architects of New Haven. It really just became a small front room that is really quite lovely in its detailing over on the right. one of the more ornate interiors of the Fairfield County Libraries, and very, very carefully connected to the new construction here in the back. In Connecticut, we were really looking at village libraries, and the colonial revival seemed to be the best form of expressing the city beautiful classicism, sort of as a village beautiful kind of moment. And architects were looking at a number of prototypes. There were a number of published drawings of architecture from the 18th century, the early 18th century. And it was the circle of Lord Burlington in London who was really pushing this notion of recreating, rethinking Palladio, the architecture of Palladio in new creative ways. Up on the upper left is one of his elevations that shows a very typical Burlington window that's used widely and associated with Burlington, because Palladio only used it on one building. But that center bay is a Palladian window with a blind arch over it. And that detail becomes sort of repeated in a lot of early buildings, including the building at the lower left, the Redwood Library in Newport in the early 18th century. Was one of the first Neo-Palladian buildings and one of the finest Neo-Palladian buildings in the United States. But the other kind of buildings that people were looking at were also the great estates in terms of the way that these center blocks could be expanded with these hyphens to create larger buildings. And these became prototypes for many of the colonial revival libraries in Fairfield County. Among the earliest is one again by architect Charles Beardsley, who did the Plum Library in Shelton. Here he's working in a colonial revival motif. It's our first two-story library building. The library itself and the reading rooms and the stacks were on the first floor. The upper floor was reserved for meeting rooms and sort of small, quiet study rooms and boardrooms. The detailing here is really quite wonderful. It's all original. It's held up very well on the building. And this is right in downtown Fairfield. And these are the two of the rooms in the upper floors that as they exist today, with a lot of really wonderful hand-painted maps on the walls. This building was also expanded. This building now occupies an entire block. It's about 8 times the size of the original building through expansion, and all different eras of colonial revival and modernism. And they basically came around, and the addition completed it on the far right here, encircling the whole block. Another building that's Neo-Palladian in inspiration, with those 2 giant columns flanking the front entrance, is the original Westport Public Library building, which is right on the Post Road. And it's really quite a wonderful building. Morris Jessup was the patron of this library. Another native son who had left Westport wanted to honor his ancestors for setting him up well in life. He was one of the wealthiest men in the United States. He was a founder of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He was the chairman of the Museum of Natural History when it was constructed in New York. He also sponsored the Perry expedition to the Arctic Circle. And he was he had widespread interests, but to give back to his hometown, he built the library. This library got outgrown by the 20th century, and you need to go across the Post Road, south of the Post Road, along the river to the new library that was built in the 1970s and recently revisited with a really interesting renovation to use the library. This building is for lease if anyone would like to use it, and waiting for adaptive reuse. I can highly recommend the coffee shop at the new library. It faces the river. It's part of a core of a new cultural center in downtown Westport, with a new open air theater that they built on the grounds adjacently, and there's a wonderful walk right along the river that I highly recommend. So next time you're in Westport, take a look at this building, but go across the street and have yourself a cup of coffee. The carving on this is really well. I haven't been able to find the architect of this building, so if anyone online tonight has any ideas on who this might be, I'm all ears. One of the really wonderful Neo-Palladian libraries is still in use as the library. It's been greatly expanded at its rear. It's the Ferguson Library in New York from in Stamford from 1909. It was designed by a local Stamford guy who Egerton Swartwood, who went on to work for McKim, Mead & White before forming his own firm and doing some major work across the country in colonial revival and neoclassical styles. The Ferguson was published in Scientific American as a fine example of a modern American library. This is what it looked like originally on the right-hand side. Those curving stairs were stairs up to the mezzanine stacks above the main entrance. The stairs are still there, but the mezzanines have all been, or the stacks have all been torn out above. And the interior has recently been cleaned up, all sorts of junk removed from it, and you really get a sense of the grace of the entrance of this building. These were what the original stacks look like. As you walked in through that door on the right, in the image on the right, you faced the stacks, and they went all the way up. They had glass floors, and I remember them as a kid. I spent hours up in the stacks, just walking along. It was a sort of a magical place. The reading rooms were off to the sides, very easily accessed and serviced by the library staff. And this is what those rooms look like now. One side is a sort of a periodical new edition area, and the other side is a used bookstore. And they have really good deals if you like used books. They've got great deals in the bookstore. They are very proud of this library. That's librarian Alice Knapp cutting the ribbon to celebrate the reopening of the plaza in front after a major restoration of the portico in front of the building a couple of years ago. New Canaan Library is one of the most interesting small, and on first glance, it looks pretty simple and uncomplicated, but it's actually a very complicated building in terms of its competition, and it has one of the greatest backstories of all the libraries in Fairfield County. It was the result of a competition among 6 architects, all who lived in New Canaan at the time in 1911. Now, like any town in Connecticut in 1911 that had 2 architects was unusual, but to have 6 architects who were summer residents and most of them became permanent residents was really unheard of. The architects they sort of anticipated the moderns that came in and may have paved the way for them. They're not really that highly celebrated yet in New Canaan, but they were all people that were trained at the École des Beaux-Arts, or they were trained by people who had been trained at the École. They all had very, very prominent careers, distinguished careers in architecture. They all donated their time in preparing the competition entries with no anticipation of any compensation. So it was all pro bono work. They wanted to give back to their community. This was not a library that had wealthy people in town at that point that could just write out a check for the entire library. So they were really trying to struggle to get this library built. This was the winning entry by Alfred Taylor, which was a very modern looking building, very contemporary with some of the buildings that were being promoted by the Carnegie Libraries that we're going to look at in a minute. And it was laid out very similar to the Carnegie Libraries. The stacks are in a room over on the left. In this case, the oddball element in the program was a room for the Historical Society, which is over in the lower right corner of the plan. And this one was very early example of a library designed to accommodate a separate children's room. The earlier generations of library, the first generation tended to divide the reading rooms by gender. So they wanted the men to be in one room and the women to be in another room. But by 1911, it was pretty clear that you needed to separate adults from children because children were just a little bit more noisy when they were using the library than adults were who were doing serious reading. For the stack, again, Taylor was looking at these Palladian windows that Burlington liked a lot. And you can see over on the left, he kind of divides it in this very unusual way to express the stacks with these very narrow windows, but in a three-part arrangement suggesting a Palladian window. On the meeting room side for the Historical Society, he uses a Burlington Palladian arch window as the major feature. And the unusual thing about this library is this major feature is not on the front of on the front elevation. It's on a side elevation. It does face a road, but it's not the prominent elevation. And then on the front elevation, he's really trying to blend this into the community to make this feel like a real authentic vernacular, because New Canaan didn't have very high style architecture. It had really good quality architecture, but nothing grand. It never had a lot of wealth in the town until people started moving in the early 20th century from New York. And so what he does here is a really interesting thing. He takes one of Burlington's compositions for Burlington's most famous building that was published called Chiswick outside of London. And he basically arranges the facade in the proportions of Chiswick. Very, very sophisticated composition. This competition was judged by the professor of architectural competition at Columbia's architecture school. So I think Taylor was really trying to win him over and get the commission, even though he wasn't paid anything for it. And he eventually got roped into serving on the library board. The interior, the contractor who actually built the building did the murals that are, he was sort of transitioning from a contractor at that time to an artist. He did the murals that are in the lunettes at the end of the vaulted ceiling in the Historical Society room. They kind of portray what Western culture was was thought of at that time, Egyptian, Greco-Roman culture. The contractor turned artist, turned architect, and went out to Hollywood and started designing Art Deco buildings later in his career. So it's here today. This building is very endangered. The New Canaan Library is building a new building, and they want to replace this with a lawn, and it could be torn down. Local preservationists have filed an appeal to the zoning board's decision permitting this, so it's still a work in progress as to whether this building. So I advise you, if you want to see this building standing, you should get up there sooner than later. A really interesting building with perhaps the biggest profile is the Jean L. Clemens Memorial, or the Mark Twain Library in Reading. This was built as a house by Mark Twain for his daughter. He was a resident of Reading, and she died, and then he decided to turn the house over to the town as a library. This is a very, very simple, this looks like a colonial building, but it was actually built in the early 20th century. And it is just a simple salt box, and it looks very much like that today. It's been added on to at the rear, just a simple reading room with the books around it. It is a sort of a memorial to Mark Twain, because that was his last residence at the end of his career. But it's a really charming place to visit. It's next to a river, and you can hear the waterfall and the river. It's a very, very pastoral thing. Surprisingly, this library was one of the first libraries in Fairfield County to consider sort of a branch library system serving the neighboring communities like Wilton, and this would have been the hub library for that, which was a very modern idea for it. So now we'll turn very quickly to the Carnegie Libraries. We don't have too many Carnegies. This is the entire list here on the right of Carnegie Libraries that were funded in Connecticut. Most of them were outside of Fairfield County, but the Bridgeport Library was the biggest recipient of Carnegie funds, and they received it to build branch libraries in their library system. And South Norwalk and Norwalk, which were two independent municipalities in the early 20th century, each got smaller Carnegie grants to build their libraries. The South Norwalk Public Library is really a textbook example of a Carnegie library. Very symmetrical. Carnegie had an architectural advisor, the Carnegie Foundation, because by the time this was built, Carnegie was the Carnegie Foundation. They had an architectural advisor who liked very much symmetry and neoclassicism, but they would go with other styles as long as it was symmetrical. And this is one of the really the best in the state. There are a couple upstate that are as good, but South Norwalk's is great. And it's still pretty much like this today. If you look at the ornament that's along the roof line on the pediment over the front entrance, that's been removed, but otherwise the building is still pretty much the same, with an addition on the back for its stacks. And the detail on this, Carnegie really liked using brick for the neoclassicism. This is a type of brick called a Roman brick, and it's actually built on a curved surface. So the brick is very thin and long and creates this wonderful shadow play when the light washes over it. This is right in downtown South Norwalk. It still functions as a local public library today. The other Carnegie Library in the present-day Norwalk is the Norwalk Public Library on Belden Avenue at the intersection of right in the center of downtown Norwalk. This is one of the more unusual libraries stylistically, and it has a very unusual pedigree. The architects here were two brothers, the Owdsley brothers. They were Brits. They were mostly interior designers, but they both migrated to the United States and set up a business as architects, designing very, very carefully designed exteriors, very sweet. Their books were published and very popular in Scotland, and it's sort of like Jacobean Tudor. A form of kind of colonial revival, if you consider Scarsdale Tudor to be a form of colonial revival, even though it really wasn't a very prominent building type in our colonial era. But very unusual library. And it's still more or less intact. The front stoop has been taken off. Carnegie really liked a major centered front stoop leading up to a hallway with all the library functions off of it, similarly arranged to the New Canaan Library. But it has a lot of exterior integrity today. And it has been enlarged with a very large addition in the rear. that is not terribly visible from the front. The interior has been very, very stripped down from its original delicate interior. It's still worth a drive-by. The other Carnegie's money went to the branch library system in Bridgeport. And Bridgeport was one of the oldest libraries established in Fairfield County. It was established during the administration of P.T. Barnum in the 1850s. But they never really had a permanent headquarters until later when the Burroughs family, Catherine Burroughs Pettingill, donated her father's department store. He was a merchant to the library for use as a library. The building, served for the library as the library for a number of years, from the 1880s up until the 1920s. But it wasn't really laid out as a library. And the librarians that came to Bridgeport was a dynamo and growing very fast. And they really built up the largest collection, a circulating collection in Fairfield County. And it really didn't serve the library that well. So by 1918, they had hired a new director of the library who put in place a series of branch libraries so they could get the books out into the neighborhoods. And these were delivered by, they were ordered by people in the neighborhood, and they were delivered on bicycle by young men and women that would bicycle through town and bring the libraries around. By 1918, Carnegie had funded two branch libraries, permanent buildings that were designed by the librarian in this case, not by an architect. And they were the East Branch and the North Branch in two neighborhoods of Bridgeport. And these were ones that followed it that weren't funded by Carnegie, but in the same mold, the South Branch and the Newfield Branch. All very, very stripped down colonial revival buildings, but all pretty similar in plan. They didn't require huge stacks. They had resident collections, but they were mostly places to receive books from the main branch. One of the finest of the branch libraries was the West Branch, named for the librarian Sanborn, who was the one that developed the branch library system. This was a very, very fine, probably as fine as the Ferguson Library was in its day in Stamford. And this was just a branch library over on the Fairfield border. And unfortunately, this library went out of the system. The city of Bridgeport has never been particularly attentive to preservation and was sold to a private entity. The private entity tore it down, and there was no protection on it, and it did get demolished. It was a real shame. It really alarmed a lot of people in Fairfield County that these buildings are not going to necessarily be with us forever unless we really try to do better with them. The main branch was also awarded on the basis of a competition when they finally got around to replacing the original department store, and was awarded to a local architect, Frederick Dixon. But really, his design was more or less a concept, and Henry Sanborn, the librarian, who the other library was named for, really was the one that laid this out. And this is really a whole different type of library than any of the other libraries we've seen, which are more village scale. This is a very urban library of the quality of, say, the Chicago Library or the Boston Public Library. A huge stack area in the rear where these looks like an industrial building from the back. And in the interior, a very modern for 1920s system of encased beams in concrete that were just openly exposed in the wall. No attempt to make them look like quaint and early at all. Very, very extensive card catalog. This library had one of the largest collections in Connecticut. I think it was even bigger than Hartford's collection at this time. And they were also the donor during World War I of an extensive amount of books to the war front in Europe, to the American troops in Europe. Very, very graceful entryway. But this is really the only decorative space within the library. The rest are very, very functional and modern looking. And then another library that's built on the eve of the Merritt Parkway is the Parrott Library in Old Greenwich. And it has a relationship with the Merritt Parkway. One of the fiercest advocates for the Merritt Parkway was Helen Binney Kitchell, a resident of what was then Sound Beach, but by the time this building is built, is Old Greenwich. She was part of the Binney family, who donated the land and the landscaping for Binney Park, which is the setting for this library. This is probably the most picturesque setting of any library in Fairfield County, if not Connecticut. It was designed by D. Everett Wade, who's a really interesting architect. This is, I believe, his only library. He did the Metropolitan Life buildings in downtown New York near Madison Square, including the one that was never finished. It was like that they, at the time that he did this library, the Depression had hit, and the Metropolitan Life Tower was never completed. He also did a very unusual tuberculosis asylum in upstate New York as well. Very, very creative architect. And he considered this to be in the Jeffersonian style of colonial revival. It's a very graceful interior. The Wade part of the building is on the right. A new children's wing was put on subsequent to the original construction, more recently, I think, in the 90s, which has a very playful interior as a children's wing. After the Parkway, we have a few libraries that really were probably only made possible by the suburban growth that was stimulated by the Parkway. And one of the best is the Weston Public Library, which was designed by one of our more talented Fairfield County architects who did the Rowayton Church, the Congregational Church in Rowayton, Joseph Salerno. And he conceived the library here as a series of different units, which the Bridgeport Library was already moving to that. They had different specialties that you went from one area of the library to go to the science and technology section, which was extensive in the Bridgeport Library. And so Weston is arranged similarly to that, with separate pavilions for separate collections. So the books are brought back into the areas where they're used. There's no separate stack area anymore by 1963. And it's a very modern composition and quite beautiful. The stonework here is, very typical of Fairfield County mid-century modern, and it's a very graceful site. Wilton Library is another one that is a very interesting library. The small white building on the left of the screen here is the second Wilton Library. It replaced an earlier very small building. And the building on the right is a more recent, larger expansion of the library when the library outgrew the building on the left. The building on the left was built was by one of Fairfield County's modern architects, Elliott Noyes, who designed a very simple white box. It's very much in his style, very plain and modern. It's now a bank. It's been recycled as a bank. And when TSKP got the award to do the new library across the parking lot from it, they did a riff on the Noyes, the original Noyes modernism. And it's a very elegant library that contains a lot of functions, including 2 interior courtyards that are really bring light right into the middle of the building. And it features, one of the features here is Dave Brubeck's piano is in the music room here. And they often give concerts out here that are really quite wonderful. So if you ever see one advertised, it's well worth going up there for. And we'll end our tour back at Greenwich. Greenwich, after they left the Milbank Anderson Library, basically bought a department store up on the Post Road and adapted it to a library, which has been subject to 2 and maybe 3 expansions. I kind of have lost track. I think that there were 2 Sherwood Milton Smith architects additions. The one at the lower center of the screen was the first edition. And then the building on the images on the right are from the Cesar Pelli edition from the 1990s, which created this really wonderful space. I had the opportunity to give a talk there before COVID in that space, and it was a delight to give a talk in there. It's a really beautiful interior, light-filled. I envy Rick that he gets to work in such a beautiful building. And so that's pretty much it for our virtual tour of libraries. I know it was kind of a whirlwind thing, but I was trying to get us done in an hour, and I think I got us a minute over. So happy to take any questions now that anyone might have.
We love it. Thanks so much, Wes. And I really enjoy how we can see on the map where we are throughout the county, throughout the Merritt Parkway, and then which exit, north or southbound. It's a great addition that helps if you're curious where to go for that specific town. We did have a couple questions come in. One from Liz asking about the stacks. As far as you know, were the stacks originally closed or were they always open to the public?
Oh, that's a great question. They were originally closed. And that was a major push of the ALA to get the stacks opened. So you can see that happening at Pequot. The original stacks are very clearly closed stacks that are only serviced by the librarians. They were actually building a special collection, so they wanted to keep them separate and not, they wanted to have some control over the librarians distributing it. But within 6 years, they decided to put the special collection in a vault and then open the stacks up to the public. And so it's a very early example of an open stack. That argument was going on. It started with the Library of Congress as to whether to let congressmen or the American people access the contents of the Library of Congress. And it went through several designs with open stacks and closed stacks. And they eventually, it's still a controlled stack system for most of the collection, but a large part of the Library of Congress is open now. So most libraries, I think you'll find that they're, New York Public is still closed stacks, but they do have open materials in the reference rooms and special collections. But some of the big urban libraries are still closed because they were just laid out that way, and it's really hard to get them open again. But the smaller village libraries were the ones that were more flexible and sort of experimenting with open stacks. The Ferguson Library was originally closed stacks, and that became open stacks by the 1940s. And
now you have a great collection of slides here. One of our attendees, Olga, was just wondering if there's a particular handout or if you plan to share these slides, or if not, is there contact information if somebody would like particular photos that you have available here?
Well, sure. I'll try to get us back to the start of the tour here, and put my. Let me share again. All right, there's my contact information.
Perfect.
Just visit us online, or you can contact me at my email address there.
Great. And possibly on fair question from Catherine. Do you have a favorite library amongst the group?
That is an unfair library. It's sort of like saying, you know, who's your favorite kid, right? I really appreciate the building type enormously. I just have great respect for the amount of thinking that goes into these buildings. And certainly from an emotional point of view, the Ferguson was the first library I ever used, and I'm really bonded to that. But I used to visit the Pequot when I was in high school. I used to visit the Parrott in high school. I went into the New York Public all the time. I was kind of a geeky library guy. So I would say that those are my favorites, just in terms of from my own personal nostalgic memory. But I really appreciate now things about the libraries that I didn't know about at the time. I think the Fairfield Library is wonderful, and the Shelton Library, the Plum Library in Shelton, was new to me. I just found that while I was researching this talk, and it's a spectacular library. So yeah, I'm not gonna say I have a single favorite, but there's definitely a top shelf group for me.
Yeah, and to the attendees and Catherine, I hope you can go check out some of those libraries that Wes talked about and see maybe if you have some that rise up in the rankings compared to others, because they look so wonderful to see all along the Merritt Parkway. So I want to thank our attendees, and thank you so much, Wes, again, for this great presentation and bringing this to our community.
You're very welcome, Rick. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks so much again, everybody.
Drive safely on the Merritt and enjoy it.
That's right. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.